It all started with a knock on the door, an aggressive, impatient rap that signaled trouble. My wife Deanna, the newly appointed county police chief, wasn't home yet. I, Marcus, a freelance architect, was in my kitchen, engrossed in blueprints, when our doorbell shrieked. Through the peephole, I saw her Marlene Blackwood, or Karen, as everyone in the Homeowners Association HOA knew her. She was our HOA president, a woman who treated her position like a dictatorial reign rather than a community service. Her usual battle armor was on a crisp pantsuit, perfectly styled hair, and that look of self-righteous indignation she wore just before making someone's life miserable. Trailing behind her was a locksmith, his toolbox an ominous sign that should have immediately raised a red flag. "Can I help you, Mrs. Blackwood?" I asked, opening the door just enough for the chain lock to hold. Karen's face snapped into official mode. "Mr. Thornfield, I'm here on official HOA business regarding violations that require immediate inspection," she announced, her voice dripping with authority. "I need access to your property to document violations and ensure compliance with emergency safety protocols." The locksmith shuffled uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. Something felt off, deeply wrong. "What violations?" I genuinely asked, confused. Our house was immaculate, arguably the best maintained on the block. Karen pulled out a thick folder of official-looking documents. Unauthorized structural modifications, improper storage zoning violations, and permit failures, she rattled off. "According to Section 47B of revised HOA guidelines, I have emergency inspection authority when violations threaten community standards." I'd read our HOA agreement inside and out, even helping design modifications for 3 other neighborhood homes. There was no Section 47B. Karen was fabricating everything. "Mrs. Blackwood, I think there's been a mistake," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "We haven't made any modifications requiring permits, and I'm not aware of any violations. Perhaps we could schedule a time when my wife is home to discuss this properly." That's when Karen's mask slipped, revealing pure fury. "Your wife," she spat, as if the words were a curse. "Your wife has been avoiding my calls and refusing HOA correspondence for weeks. This disrespectful behavior is plaguing this community, and I won't tolerate it." She turned to the locksmith. "We're proceeding with emergency inspection. Begin with the front door lock." The locksmith looked even more uncomfortable, glancing between us. "Ma'am, I can't do this without homeowner consent. The paperwork doesn't look like an official court order." Karen's response was swift and vicious. "Are you questioning my authority? I'm the duly elected HOA president, and I have every right to protect this community from people who ignore the rules." She dramatically pulled out her phone. "If you won't help me access this property, I'll call the police and let them handle obstruction of official HOA business." "Mrs. Blackwood, you're free to call the police if you think there's been a crime," I said, maintaining my composure. "But I'm not letting anyone into my house without proper legal authority. And this isn't how HOA inspections work." I looked at the locksmith. "So changing locks on someone else's house without permission is breaking and entering regardless of her paperwork." The locksmith immediately packed up his tools. "Sorry, lady, this isn't what I signed up for," he muttered, heading to his van. Karen completely lost it. Her composure crumbled, and suddenly I was looking at someone having a public meltdown. "You people think you can move into our neighborhood and ignore everything we've built," she screamed loud enough for the whole street to hear. "I've dealt with your type before, people who think rules don't apply, people who think they can take whatever they want." She fumbled with her phone hands, shaking with rage. "Fine, I'm calling the police, and we'll see how smug you are when they drag you out in handcuffs." As Karen dialed 911, ranting about community standards, I had no idea this was just the beginning. I didn't know about 6 other terrorized families, fake documents, manipulated property lines, or millions in fraud. And I didn't know that our neighbor, Ms. Eleanor Vance, was watching from her window, taking notes and recording everything. While Karen made her first call, claiming I was threatening her, I was just thinking about explaining this bizarre incident to Deanna. But as Karen ended the call and immediately started dialing again, with grim determination, I realized this would be a much longer day than planned. 23 minutes later, I watched from my window as a police cruiser pulled up to the curb. Karen had been pacing my front yard like a caged animal, talking loudly on her phone, presumably to other HOA board members, painting herself as the victim of some domestic terrorism. 2 young officers stepped out, and I could see Karen immediately switch into her performance mode. Officer Jenkins, according to his name tag, looked like he'd graduated from the academy last week, while his partner, Officer Miller, seemed slightly more experienced but still green enough to believe whatever sob story Karen was about to sell. "Officers, thank God you're here," Karen began, her voice taking on a trembling quality that would have impressed any drama teacher. "I've been threatened and verbally assaulted by the man in that house simply for trying to perform my legal duties as HOA president. He's been hostile and aggressive, and I'm genuinely concerned for my safety." She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue that appeared from nowhere, a performance so rehearsed it was almost impressive. His wife has been completely uncooperative with official HOA business, and when I came to conduct a legally mandated inspection, he became violent and threatening. I stepped outside before this fiction could take root any deeper. "Officers, I'm Marcus Thornfield, and I live here." Mrs. Blackwood came to my door, demanding entry to my home with a locksmith claiming some kind of emergency inspection authority that doesn't exist in our HOA agreement. When I politely declined and asked her to schedule a proper meeting, she became increasingly agitated and called you. Officer Jenkins looked between Karen and me, clearly trying to process the situation. "Sir, do you have some identification we could see?" he asked, his hand instinctively moving toward his radio. That's when Ms. Eleanor Vance appeared, moving with surprising speed for a 72-year-old woman. "Officers, I've been watching this entire situation unfold from my window," she announced, in that crisp, no-nonsense voice that immediately commanded attention. Eleanor had been our neighbor for 30 years, a retired architect who'd helped design half the original homes in Oakwood Heights. Mrs. Blackwood has been harassing multiple families in this neighborhood with similar tactics for months. Just last week, she tried the same thing with the O'Malleys on Maple Street, claiming they needed emergency inspections and bringing strangers to their property. Karen's face went through several color changes, settling on an angry red. "Mrs. Vance, you're confused about the situation. This is official HOA business, and I don't appreciate your interference in legal proceedings." But Eleanor wasn't backing down. She pulled out her phone and held it up for the officers to see. "I have video footage of the entire confrontation, including Mrs. Blackwood's attempts to force entry with an unauthorized locksmith and her escalating threats when Mr. Thornfield reasonably refused her demands." Officer Miller stepped forward, looking more interested now. "Ma'am, if you have video evidence, we'd like to see it." Karen immediately objected. "This is harassment. You can't just take the word of some confused elderly woman over an elected community leader." The way she said "elderly woman" dripped with condescension, and I saw Eleanor's eyes narrow dangerously. "Young lady," Eleanor said with ice in her voice, "I was practicing architecture before you were born, and I know the difference between legal authority and neighborhood bullying." The tension was reaching a breaking point when I heard the sound that changed everything. A car door slammed, and Deanna's voice cut through the chaos. "What's going on here?" My wife appeared in full uniform, her police chief badge visible, having returned early from her meeting. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Both young officers snapped to attention, while Karen's face went through a series of expressions that would have been funny if the situation weren't so serious. "Chief Thornfield," Officer Jenkins stammered clearly, not expecting his new boss to emerge from the house they'd been called to investigate. "We received a call about a domestic disturbance and possible obstruction of official business. Mrs. Blackwood here claims there was a conflict over some kind of HOA inspection." Deanna looked at Karen with the kind of calm professional assessment that made hardened criminals confess their crimes. "Mrs. Blackwood, would you like to explain to me exactly what official authority you believe gives you the right to force entry into my home?" Karen's response was swift but desperate. "Chief Thornfield, surely you understand the importance of community standards and regulations. As the HOA president, I have responsibilities to ensure all residents comply with established guidelines. The fact that you're married to this man creates an obvious conflict of interest. I demand you recuse yourself from this situation and call in outside officers to handle this matter properly." But Karen made a critical error. Instead of accepting the situation gracefully, she doubled down. "This is exactly what I was talking about," she announced loudly, pulling out her phone again. "Police corruption and abuse of power right here in our neighborhood. Everyone needs to see this." She started recording, speaking directly to her camera. "I'm being intimidated by a police chief who's protecting her husband from legitimate legal proceedings. This is the kind of corruption that's destroying our communities." Eleanor stepped closer to the officers, her voice carrying years of authority. "Gentlemen, I've lived in this neighborhood for 3 decades, and I've watched Mrs. Blackwood systematically intimidate and harass families until they either comply with her demands or move away. She's driven out 6 families in the past 2 years using these same tactics." Karen's live stream was still running, but her confident expression was starting to crack as Eleanor continued. "The O'Malleys, the Sanchez family, the elderly Petersons, all forced to sell and leave because of her harassment campaigns." As Karen continued her performance for her phone camera, spinning a tale of police corruption and abuse of power, Deanna remained professionally calm. "Mrs. Blackwood, you're free to file any complaints you feel are necessary through proper channels. However, this incident is now concluded. Officers Jenkins and Miller thank you for responding promptly." But as the officers prepared to leave, and Karen ended her live stream with promises to expose the truth, I noticed a calculating look in her eyes. This wasn't over. I had the sinking feeling that Karen's social media performance was just the opening move in a much larger game. Within an hour of the officers leaving, Karen's video was everywhere. She'd uploaded it to Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter with the kind of strategic precision that would make a social media manager jealous. The title read, "New Police Chief Threatens Innocent Homeowner Corruption Exposed," and it was spreading through our local community groups like wildfire. I watched in real time as the view count climbed from dozens to hundreds to thousands, each share adding fuel to Karen's carefully crafted narrative. The video was a masterpiece of manipulation. Karen had edited out the part where she'd tried to force entry with the locksmith, the part where Eleanor provided contradictory evidence, and everything that would make her look bad. Instead, it showed a concerned community leader being intimidated by a corrupt police chief, protecting her criminal husband. The comments section was exactly what you'd expect, a toxic mixture of outrage, conspiracy theories, and people who'd never met any of us but were certain about our guilt. "This is what's wrong with America today," wrote someone named Patriot Mom 47. Police protecting their own, while honest citizens get trampled. Another comment from Truth Seeker 2024 read, "I bet there's money changing hands here. Follow the money, people." But then something interesting started happening. Other voices began appearing in the comment thread, and they weren't supporting Karen's version of events. "I live 3 streets over," posted Jennifer White, a name I recognized from neighborhood barbecues. "Marlene Blackwood has been terrorizing families in this area for months. She tried the same thing with us last spring, claiming our kids' swing set violated some made-up HOA rule." The comment got 47 likes in minutes. Then came another, "My elderly parents had to sell their house because of this woman's harassment. She's not protecting anyone. She's a neighborhood bully with a power complex." Eleanor proving that 72-year-olds could master social media when motivated had created her response video. Unlike Karen's edited propaganda, Eleanor's footage showed the entire confrontation from start to finish, complete with timestamps and her crisp narration explaining the legal realities of HOA authority. As someone who helped write the original HOA guidelines for this neighborhood 30 years ago, Eleanor stated directly to the camera, "I can assure viewers that no such emergency inspection powers exist, and Mrs. Blackwood's behavior constitutes criminal harassment." However, Karen wasn't going down without a fight. She organized what she called an emergency community safety meeting at the local community center, using her HOA president status to reserve the space. The flyers she posted around the neighborhood were inflammatory masterpieces: "Protect your family from police corruption and demand accountability from your new police chief." She'd managed to twist the narrative so completely that people who'd never even spoken to Deanna were calling for her resignation. The meeting itself was a circus. Karen had packed the room with her supporters, mostly older residents who'd bought into her fear-mongering about property values and community standards. She stood at the front of the room like a general addressing troops, her voice carrying that same righteous indignation I'd witnessed at my front door. "We cannot allow our neighborhood to become a haven for corruption and lawlessness," she declared to enthusiastic applause. "When the very people we trust to protect us start protecting criminals instead, we have to take action." But Eleanor had done her homework. She'd spent the week since our confrontation talking to every family in the neighborhood, documenting Karen's pattern of harassment and abuse. When it came time for community input, Eleanor stood up with a thick folder of her own. "I'd like to share some information about Mrs. Blackwood's actual track record as HOA president," she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "The O'Malleys on Maple Street, forced to sell after Karen claimed their garden violated imaginary regulations. The Sanchez family harassed for months over the color of their front door until they moved out of state." Each example Eleanor presented was documented with photos, emails, and witness statements. The room's energy shifted as she spoke, the applause for Karen's rhetoric gradually replaced by uncomfortable murmurs. The Peterson family, both in their 80s, forced to spend their retirement savings on legal fees defending against frivolous HOA violations that mysteriously disappeared once they agreed to sell their home below market value. Karen tried to regain control, but her supporters were wavering. When Mr. Tom Riley from Oak Street stood up and confirmed that Karen had tried similar tactics with his family, even her most loyal followers started looking uncomfortable. "She came to our house with the same locksmith, same fake paperwork, same threats," Tom testified. "The only reason we didn't get forced out is because my brother-in-law is a lawyer and called her bluff." The tide was turning, but Karen had one more card to play. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," she shouted over the growing dissent. "They've turned you against me, manipulated you into supporting corruption. Well, I have information that none of you know about. I have evidence of illegal activities, financial improprieties, and abuse of power that goes far beyond what you've seen." Her voice took on a dangerous edge. "And if this community won't stand up for what's right, I'll take this to people who will." As the meeting dissolved into chaos, with neighbors arguing and Karen storming out, while promising to expose the truth, I noticed something that chilled me. Eleanor grabbed my arm as we left the community center. "Marcus, we need to talk privately," she said quietly. "There's something about Karen that you and Deanna need to know. Something I discovered when I was researching property records for tonight's presentation." Her expression was grim. "I think we've stumbled into something much bigger and more dangerous than neighborhood harassment." The drive home was silent, but my mind was racing. Karen's threat about taking this to people who will act echoed in my head, combined with Eleanor's ominous warning about property records. I was starting to realize that our small neighborhood dispute might be just the tip of a very large and very dangerous iceberg. Eleanor invited Deanna and me over for coffee the next morning, but this wasn't a social call. Her dining room table was covered with maps, legal documents, and printouts that looked like they belonged in a detective's evidence room. "I've been investigating property records since our confrontation," Eleanor began, her usually warm demeanor replaced by grim determination. "What I found explains everything about Karen's behavior, and it's worse than harassment. It's systematic fraud." She spread out a large map of our neighborhood, overlaid with transparency sheets showing different periods. "This is Oakwood Heights as it was originally platted in 1995, Eleanor explained, pointing to the base map. "I helped design 6 of these homes, so I know the original property lines by heart." She placed the first transparency over the base map. "This is how the property boundaries appeared in HOA records from 2015. Then came another sheet. And this is what the records showed today." The difference was staggering. Property lines had shifted, lot sizes had changed, and entire sections of what should have been common area had somehow become private property. "Every single modification benefits Karen or her associates," Eleanor continued. "Look at this." She pointed to Karen's property, which had mysteriously expanded by nearly half an acre over the past decade, absorbing what used to be community green space. Deanna leaned forward, her police chief training kicking in. "Eleanor, do you have documentation showing when these changes were made and who authorized them?" Eleanor smiled grimly and pulled out another folder. "That's where it gets interesting. Every single modification was approved during emergency HOA meetings that most residents never knew about. The meetings were properly noticed according to the letter of the law, but the notices were posted in locations where nobody would see them. She showed us copies of meeting minutes buried in obscure community bulletin boards, legal notices placed in the classified sections of newspapers nobody read, and email notifications sent to addresses that residents hadn't used in years. It's technically legal, but designed to ensure no one would show up to object. Karen's been running these phantom meetings for 8 years, systematically redistributing property boundaries to benefit herself and a small group of associates. But the real bombshell was still coming. Eleanor pulled out a manila envelope marked "Confidential" and spread its contents across the table, bank statements, wire transfer records, and corporate documents that made my head spin. "Karen isn't working alone," Eleanor said quietly. "She's partnered with a development company called Summit Properties LLC. They've been buying up the properties that families like the O'Malleys and Sanchez's were forced to sell, always at below market prices." Deanna picked up one of the documents, her expression growing darker. This shows Summit Properties purchased the Peterson property for 60% of its assessed value, then immediately flipped it for full market price to another buyer. Eleanor nodded. And if you look at the corporate filings, Summit Properties LLC is owned by a holding company, which is owned by another company, but I managed to trace it back. The ultimate owner is Karen's ex-husband, Robert Blackwood. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. So Karen harasses families until they're desperate to sell where, I said slowly, they sell cheap to Summit Properties, which is secretly controlled by her ex-husband, and then the property gets resold at full value. They split the profits. Eleanor's expression was grim. It's worse than that. Look at this. She showed us a surveyor's report that made my blood run cold. Remember how Karen was so desperate to get into your house, Marcus? She wasn't looking for HOA violations. She was looking for your father's original architectural plans. Eleanor's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Your father designed this entire neighborhood, and his plans are the only remaining documentation of the true property boundaries. With those plans, someone could prove that every single property modification Karen has made over the past 8 years is fraudulent. Deanna was already reaching for her phone. This is evidence of conspiracy, fraud, and possibly RICO violations. We need to contact the FBI immediately. But Eleanor held up a hand. There's more. Yesterday, when I was researching the corporate connections, I discovered something that explains why Karen was so confident about her fake emergency powers. She pulled out another document that made Deanna's face go pale. Agent Reynolds, FBI Financial Crimes Division. Deanna read from the business card clipped to the document. He contacted me 6 months ago. Eleanor's voice was steady, but her hands were shaking slightly. The Bureau has been investigating a multi-state real estate fraud ring. Summit Properties isn't just operating here in Oakwood Heights. They're part of a network that's been systematically defrauding homeowners across 17 different communities in 5 states. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. The FBI has been building a case, but they needed proof of the original property boundaries to demonstrate the fraud, Eleanor continued. Agent Reynolds asked me to be an informant because of my architectural background and long-term residence. I've been documenting Karen's activities for months, but I never imagined the scope was this large. Deanna stood up, her police chief authority taking over. Eleanor, we need to contact Agent Reynolds immediately. This has moved beyond local jurisdiction. But as she reached for her phone, we heard the sound that made our blood freeze, car doors slamming outside, followed by heavy footsteps on Eleanor's front porch. Through the window, I could see Karen approaching with 2 men in expensive suits, and her expression was nothing like the unhinged community activist we'd seen before. This was the face of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and was prepared to do whatever it took to protect their operation. She knows, Eleanor whispered. Somehow Karen figured out that we're on to her. The doorbell rang, but this time it wasn't the aggressive hammering we'd experienced before. This was the patient, confident ring of people who were certain they held all the cards. Deanna's hand moved instinctively toward her service weapon as Karen's voice carried through the door, calm and controlled in a way that was far more terrifying than her previous hysteria. Mrs. Vance, we need to discuss some recent developments regarding your research activities. I think you'll find our conversation very enlightening. The conversation that followed was surreal. Karen sat in Eleanor's living room like she owned the place, flanked by 2 men who introduced themselves as legal representatives from Summit Properties. She'd completely abandoned her neighborhood busybody persona and was now operating with the cold efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before. Mrs. Vance, we understand you've been conducting some amateur research into property records, she said, with a smile that never reached her eyes. Unfortunately, some of your methods have violated privacy laws and trespassing statutes. The taller of the two suits, who called himself Mr. Davidson, pulled out a tablet and began reading from what appeared to be a legal document. We have evidence of unauthorized access to private property records, harassment of legitimate business operators, and conspiracy to interfere with lawful commercial activities. Deanna started to object, but the second man, Mr. Walsh, held up a hand. Chief Thornfield, we're aware of your position, but this matter involves federal jurisdiction and interstate commerce violations. We'd prefer to handle this quietly through proper civil channels. It was a masterpiece of legal intimidation. Every word was carefully chosen to sound official while dancing right up to the line of actual threats. Karen's transformation was complete. Gone was the shrieking HOA president, replaced by someone who clearly understood how to manipulate the legal system. "Eleanor, dear," she said with fake sweetness, "you've gotten yourself involved in something far beyond your understanding. The best thing for everyone would be to forget about your little research project and return any documents you may have acquired." But Eleanor wasn't backing down. "I know exactly what you're doing, Marlene. You've been systematically defrauding families for years, and now you're trying to intimidate us into silence." Karen's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing a flash of genuine fury. "You old fool, do you have any idea who you're dealing with? This operation spans 5 states and involves people with resources you can't imagine." That's when everything went sideways. Deanna's phone rang, and the caller ID showed FBI Agent Reynolds. His voice was tense. "Chief Thornfield, we have a situation. We've just arrested Agent Harrison from our field office for leaking information to targets of our investigation. We have reason to believe your location has been compromised and you need to evacuate immediately." The two suits exchanged glances, and Karen's confident expression faltered slightly. Mr. Davidson stood up smoothly. "I think we've covered everything we need to discuss today, Mrs. Vance. We trust you'll consider our conversation carefully." But as they moved toward the door, Agent Reynolds' voice crackled through Deanna's phone speaker. "Chief, we're tracking multiple vehicles converging on your location. Get out now, or keep to..." Deanna was already moving her police training, taking over. "Eleanor, grab your evidence. We're leaving through the back door." But Karen's calm facade was cracking. "You don't understand," she shouted as we headed for Eleanor's kitchen. "They don't just want the evidence destroyed, they want you eliminated. I tried to handle this quietly, but you've forced their hand." We made it to Eleanor's backyard, just as 3 black SUVs pulled up to the front of the house. Deanna called for backup while we moved through the neighborhood's interconnected backyards. But Karen's voice followed us with a chilling confession. 20 years. I've built this life. 20 years since Robert left me with nothing. You think I chose this? They own me now, and if I don't deliver, they'll kill me too. The next few hours were a blur of safe houses and FBI debriefings. Agent Reynolds explained that their investigation had been compromised from the beginning. Agent Harrison had been feeding information to the criminal network, warning them about federal interest and helping them stay ahead of the investigation. "The operation is much larger than we initially realized," Reynolds told us in a secure conference room. "Summit Properties is just one arm of an organization that's been systematically targeting suburban communities across the country. But here's where things took an unexpected turn. Due to the compromised investigation and the illegal surveillance that the criminal organization had been conducting, all the evidence Eleanor had gathered was now considered inadmissible in court. Worse, Deanna was being placed on administrative leave, pending an investigation into potential conflicts of interest. and procedural violations. The very fact that she was married to someone involved in the case was being used against her. "I don't understand," Deanna said, her voice tight with frustration. "We're the victims here. How are we being treated like criminals?" Agent Reynolds looked uncomfortable. "The organization has very good lawyers, and they've managed to turn the legal situation upside down. They're claiming that Mrs. Vance conducted illegal surveillance, that you abused your position as police chief, and that Marcus interfered with lawful business activities." Karen, meanwhile, had vanished. Her house was empty, her phone disconnected, and according to neighbors, she had left in the middle of the night with several suitcases. For 48 hours, it looked like she'd gotten away with everything. The criminal organization had successfully neutralized the investigation, eliminated the evidence, and made their primary local operator disappear before she could become a liability. But that evening, as Deanna and I sat in our living room feeling defeated and wondering if we'd ever see justice, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Eleanor's number, but the voice that answered wasn't hers. "Mr. Thornfield, this is Daniel Blackwood, Karen's son." His voice was shaking, but determined. "I've been working with the FBI for 6 months, providing evidence about my mother's activities. She doesn't know, but I recorded everything, every conversation, every meeting, every confession." The silence stretched between us as the implications sank in. "Daniel, where are you? Are you safe?" He laughed bitterly. "Safe? My mother just tried to kill me, Mr. Thornfield. She found out about my cooperation with the FBI and she completely snapped. She's not the woman you think you know. She's capable of things that would terrify you." His voice dropped to a whisper. "But I have everything. Every detail of the operation, every name, every location, and tomorrow the whole world is going to know the truth." Daniel Blackwood met us at a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town. His face was a roadmap of bruises, and his left arm was in a makeshift sling. He looked like he'd aged a decade in the past week, and when he sat down across from Deanna and me, his hands wouldn't stop shaking. "You have to understand," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "My mother isn't the person any of you think she is. She's been living a double life for so long that I'm not sure she even knows who she is anymore." He pulled out a small digital recorder and placed it on the table between us. 6 months ago, Agent Reynolds approached me. They'd been investigating Summit Properties and traced some connections back to my father and mother. I thought it was a mistake at first. I mean, my mum's crazy about HOA rules and neighborhood drama. But a criminal, it seemed impossible. Daniel's laugh was bitter and hollow. Then I started paying attention to her phone calls, her late-night meetings, the people who would come to the house when she thought I was asleep. The recordings he played for us were devastating. Karen's voice crystal clear, discussing property fraud, intimidation tactics, and what she euphemistically called permanent solutions for people who wouldn't cooperate. "The Peterson family is becoming a problem," her voice crackled through the tiny speaker. "They are asking too many questions about the survey discrepancies. We need to accelerate their timeline." Another voice, older and more gravelly, responded, "How accelerated are we talking? Financial pressure or something more direct?" "That's Victor Rossi," Daniel explained, pausing the recording. "He runs the entire Eastern Seaboard operation. Summit Properties is just one of dozens of shell companies they use. They've been systematically targeting suburban communities for over 15 years, using local operatives like my mother to identify vulnerable properties and pressure families into selling." Deanna leaned forward, her cop instincts fully engaged despite her suspension. "Daniel, these recordings could put dozens of people in federal prison. Why haven't you turned them over to the FBI already?" Daniel's expression darkened. "Because 3 days ago, I discovered that Agent Harrison wasn't the only FBI informant working for Rossi's organization. There's someone higher up, someone with access to witness protection protocols and safe house locations. When I told Agent Reynolds about my suspicions, he went pale and told me to disappear until he could verify the leak. He ran his uninjured hand through his hair. That night, my mother came home with Victor and 2 other men. They weren't there to talk. The story Daniel told us was chilling. Karen had discovered his cooperation with the FBI through the corrupted channels within the Bureau itself. Her reaction wasn't maternal disappointment or even anger. It was cold, calculated fury. She looked at me like I was a stranger, Daniel said quietly. Like I was just another obstacle to be removed. That's when I realized that whatever she'd become over the years, there wasn't any trace left of the woman who used to read me bedtime stories. The attack had been swift and brutal. Victor's men had held Daniel while Karen methodically went through his room, searching for recording equipment and evidence. She found my backup drives, Daniel continued, but what she didn't know is that I'd been uploading everything to a secure cloud server that Agent Reynolds set up. Every conversation, every meeting, every confession, it's all there, time-stamped and GPS tagged. But Karen's transformation went deeper than anyone had realized. Daniel played another recording, this one from just 2 days earlier. Karen's voice was different now, stripped of any pretense of neighborhood concern or community leadership. Victor, the FBI, knows about the 17 communities. They have maps, financial records, everything. We need to implement the Scorched Earth Protocol. Victor's response was immediate. How many witnesses are we talking about? Karen's answer made my blood freeze. 7 primary targets, including my son, the old woman, the police chief, her husband, and the 3 families who've been feeding information to the feds. Deanna's face had gone white. Daniel, are you saying they're planning to kill all the witnesses? Daniel nodded grimly. Tonight, Victor brought in a crew from out of state. They're professionals, and they're going to make it look like a series of random break-ins gone wrong. My mother gave them addresses, schedules, security codes, everything they need. He looked directly at me. Mr. Thornfield, they know Deanna's been suspended and stripped of her weapon. They know Eleanor lives alone. They think you're all sitting ducks. But Daniel had one more revelation that changed everything. There's something else, he said, pulling out a thick manila envelope. While they were beating me, trying to get me to reveal where I'd hidden the evidence, my mother started ranting about why she'd gotten involved with Rossi's people in the first place. He opened the envelope and spread out documents that made Deanna gasp. She didn't just marry my father, Robert, she killed him. The death certificate listed Robert Blackwood's cause of death as accidental drowning, but the documents Daniel had uncovered told a different story. Insurance policies taken out months before his death, life insurance policies that Karen had fought to collect despite their pending divorce, and most damning of all, a recording of Karen confessing to Victor about how she'd handled the Robert problem years earlier. She drugged him and pushed him into the lake, Daniel said flatly. She discovered that he was planning to expose the property fraud scheme to federal authorities, so she eliminated him and made it look like an accident. That's when Victor's people recruited her fully. They had evidence of the murder, so she couldn't refuse their demands. Daniel's voice cracked. I've been living with my father's killer for 10 years, thinking she was just an obsessive perfectionist. As Daniel finished his story, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Marcus, this is Eleanor. They cut my power and phone lines. I can see men surrounding my house. If you get this message, don't come home. They're waiting for you too. Deanna was already moving, reaching for her backup weapon, despite her suspension. "We need to call Agent Reynolds immediately," she said. But Daniel shook his head. "Reynolds is dead. They killed him this afternoon and made it look like a car accident." The diner suddenly felt very small and very exposed. Through the windows, I could see black SUVs pulling into the parking lot, and Daniel's face went ashen. "They found us," he whispered. "Victor always said, there's no way you can run when you betray the family." Deanna grabbed the recorder and the evidence envelope. "Is there a back exit?" But even as we moved toward the kitchen, I could see more vehicles surrounding the building. Karen's voice echoed in my memory from the recordings. "Sometimes the only way to solve a problem permanently is to make sure there are no witnesses left to tell the story." What happened next proved that sometimes the cavalry does arrive just when you need it most. As Victor's men closed in on the diner, the parking lot suddenly lit up like Times Square. FBI tactical vehicles, local police units, and federal marshals swarmed the area with military precision. Agent Sarah Chen Reynolds' partner came through the diner's front door with a full tactical team, her voice cutting through our panic. "Daniel Blackwood, you're safe now. We've been tracking your location through the cloud server." The relief was overwhelming. Agent Chen quickly explained how they'd managed to turn the tables. "Agent Reynolds faked his death this afternoon with our help. We suspected there was a high-level leak, so we set up a fake assassination to flush out the remaining informants." Through the diner windows, I could see Victor Rossi being dragged out of one of the SUVs in handcuffs, his professional composure finally cracking. "Your recordings," Daniel gave us everything we needed to identify the entire network. But the most satisfying moment came when they brought Karen in. Gone was any pretense of suburban respectability. She looked exactly like what she was, a cornered criminal who'd run out of options and allies. When she saw Daniel sitting safely with us, her mask finally slipped completely. "You ungrateful little bastard," she screamed, lunging toward our table before two agents restrained her. "I gave you everything. I built this life for us, and you destroyed it all." Daniel's response was quiet but devastating. "You didn't build anything, Mom. You stole it from Dad, from our neighbors, from everyone who trusted you." Karen's face went through a series of expressions that would have been fascinating if they weren't so disturbing: rage, denial, self-pity, and finally a kind of broken confusion as she realized that even her son saw her for what she truly was. The trial took place 6 months later, and it was everything you'd hope for in terms of justice being served. The federal courthouse was packed with representatives from all 17 communities that had been victimized by the fraud ring, families who'd lost their homes, elderly couples who'd been terrorized into selling, and dozens of people who'd had their lives disrupted by Karen's systematic harassment campaign. Eleanor, now 73 and sharper than ever, had organized what she called the Coalition of Common Sense, and they'd all come to watch justice finally prevail. Karen's legal team tried everything. They claimed she was a victim herself, coerced by Victor's organization after her husband's death. They argued temporary insanity, diminished capacity, and even attempted to paint her as a whistleblower who'd been gathering evidence to expose the fraud ring. But Daniel's recordings were devastating, hour after hour, of Karen's voice coldly planning harassment campaigns, discussing permanent solutions for uncooperative neighbors, and bragging about how she'd handled the Robert problem. The prosecution painted a picture of a woman who'd started with legitimate grief over her husband's abandonment, but had gradually been corrupted by greed and power until she became something monstrous. Marlene Blackwood didn't stumble into this criminal organization, the prosecutor stated during closing arguments. She enthusiastically joined. It became one of its most effective operators, and when her son tried to stop her, she was prepared to have him killed. When the verdict came back, Karen was facing the judge for 31 felony counts: conspiracy, fraud, racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, and the big one, first-degree murder in the death of Robert Blackwood. The jury had deliberated for less than 3 hours. As each guilty verdict was read, I watched Karen's expression change from defiance to desperation to something that looked almost like relief. Judge Martinez, a stern woman who'd seen too many cases like this one, didn't mince words during sentencing. "Mrs. Blackwood, you systematically terrorized innocent families, destroyed communities, and betrayed every trust placed in you. You turned neighborhood leadership into a criminal enterprise and showed no remorse until you were caught." Karen received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 25 years for the fraud conspiracy. But the real victory wasn't just Karen's conviction. Victor Rossi's entire network collapsed like a house of cards. Federal raids across 5 states netted 43 arrests, recovered over $12 million in fraudulent property transfers, and most importantly, provided restitution for hundreds of families who'd been victimized. Deanna was not only reinstated, but also received commendation for her role in exposing the corruption. Eleanor became something of a local celebrity, using her experience to help other communities identify and combat similar fraud schemes. Daniel entered witness protection initially, but eventually returned to help families reclaim their properties using his insider knowledge of the organization's methods. The 17 communities affected by the fraud ring each received federal grants to hire independent auditors and review all property transfers from the past decade. As for me, I got back to designing houses instead of investigating criminal conspiracies. Deanna and I learned to appreciate our quiet neighborhood evenings, though we both still tense up when someone knocks unexpectedly. The community garden that now sits where Karen's house used to be has become a symbol of what neighborhoods can accomplish when people work together, instead of allowing themselves to be divided by fear and manipulation. This extraordinary series of events taught us a profound lesson. The strength of a community lies not in blind adherence to authority, but in the vigilance and collective courage of its residents. It's a reminder that seemingly small injustices can hide much larger conspiracies, and that standing up for what's right, even against overwhelming odds, is a responsibility we all share. Eleanor proved that age and experience matter. Daniel showed that courage can come from the most unexpected places, and together we demonstrated that ordinary people can stand up to sophisticated criminal organizations when they refuse to be intimidated. Sometimes justice does prevail, especially when good people decide they've had enough of being pushed around. If you enjoyed hearing about how we took down Karen and her criminal network, please like this video and subscribe to HOA Stories for more real-life tales of ordinary people fighting back against extraordinary circumstances. These stories matter because they remind us that standing up for what's right isn't just the responsibility of law enforcement or government officials. It's something every one of us can and should do when we see injustice in our communities.